The sky was a violent shade of gray, heavy clouds rolling over the open plains of my ranch like angry waves. The wind howled through the trees, bending them to its will, and the rain came down in torrents, pounding against the tin roof of the barn. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, locking up the last of the stalls. The horses neighed softly, uneasy from the storm, their hooves shuffling against the hay-strewn floor. Thunder cracked in the distance, sharp and sudden, making me flinch. I cursed under my breath, pushing the barn doors shut with a grunt and sliding the bolt into place. I turned back toward the house, my boots squelching in the mud with every step. That's when I saw it, a silhouette stumbling through the rain, barely visible in the dim light of the storm. The figure moved clumsily, like the weight of the rain was dragging him down. My first instinct was caution. Strangers don't usually wander onto my land, especially not in weather like this. But something in the way he stumbled, hands clutching his sides, head bowed against the wind, stirred something in me. I quickened my pace, the rain biting against my skin as I jogged toward him. As I got closer, I saw him more clearly. A young man, maybe late 20s, soaked to the bone. His clothes clung to him, plastered against his frame, his hair matted and dripping. His hands were trembling, lips a faint shade of blue. "You're gonna catch your death out here," I shouted over the roar of the storm. "Get inside, quick!" He looked up, blinking rainwater out of his eyes. For a second he hesitated, as if deciding whether I was friend or foe. But then a gust of wind nearly knocked him sideways, and he nodded, stumbling forward. I wrapped an arm around his shoulder, steadying him as we trudged toward the house. His body was ice-cold under my grip, and I could feel him shivering violently. I pushed the door open and guided him inside, slamming it shut behind us. The sudden silence was jarring. Outside, the wind still screamed and the rain battered the windows, but inside, it was just the two of us. The warmth of the house seeped into my skin, a stark contrast to the biting chill outside. He stood there, dripping onto the wooden floor, his eyes darting around as if unsure he was actually safe. I grabbed a towel from the hallway closet and tossed it to him. "Here, dry off." He caught it clumsily, his hands shaking as he rubbed it over his face and through his hair. Up close, I could see him better. Sharp jawline, tired eyes, and a stubble that looked like it had been neglected for days. His hands were rough and calloused, like he'd seen his fair share of hard work. I moved toward the fireplace, tossing a few logs onto the embers and stoking the flames until they roared back to life. The room filled with warmth and light, shadows, dancing across the walls. I turned back to him. "Your clothes are soaked. Got some spare ones upstairs if you want to change." He hesitated again, eyes flickering to the fire, then back to me. I didn't know where else to go." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Storm like that. You're lucky you made it this far," I replied. "Go on. I'll grab you some dry clothes." I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, rifling through my closet until I found some sweats and a flannel shirt. When I came back down, he hadn't moved, still dripping onto the floor, towel clutched to his chest. I handed him the clothes. "Bathroom's down the hall. You can get changed in there." He nodded, clutching the bundle to his chest like it was the most precious thing he'd ever been given. I watched him disappear down the hallway, the soft creak of the bathroom door closing behind him. I exhaled, suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating. I rubbed the back of my neck, glancing at the trail of water he'd left behind. His silhouette, framed in the doorway, had looked almost fragile, vulnerable. When he returned, dressed in my clothes, his hair damp but combed back, I felt my breath catch. The flannel hung a little loose on him, but it suited him, softening the edges of his sharp features. He met my gaze, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "Don't mention it," I replied, forcing a smile. "Storm's still raging out there. Looks like you'll be here for a while." He nodded, moving closer to the fire, stretching his hands out to the warmth. I couldn't help but glance at him again, catching the way his muscles shifted under the fabric, the way the light flickered across his face. I turned, away quickly, clearing my throat. "What's your name, anyway?" He looked back at me, eyes softening just a bit. Blake. Blake, I repeated, tasting the name on my tongue. Well, Blake, welcome to the ranch. Make yourself at home. There was a tension in the room, unspoken, heavy, lingering in the air, and somehow I knew that night was just the beginning. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Rain pounded against the windows, rolling down in heavy sheets, while thunder rumbled low and steady in the distance. The living room glowed softly, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting warm light across the worn leather couches and faded rugs. Blake sat across from me, wrapped in one of my thick blankets, his hands still shaking slightly as he cradled the cup of whiskey I'd handed him. I took a sip from my own glass, the liquid burning pleasantly on the way down. He watched me over, the rim of his cup, his eyes reflecting the light of the fire. For the first time since he showed up drenched and stumbling through the mud, I got a good look at him. His hair was still damp, strands clinging to his forehead, and his face was sharp but softened by a layer of scruff. He didn't seem much older than me, late 20s, maybe early 30s. So, I began, setting my glass down on the table between us. Blake, huh? What brings you wandering out here in the middle of a storm? He chuckled, the sound low and a bit rough. Car broke down about 10 miles back. I started walking, didn't realize how far it really was. He took another sip, eyes wandering around the room. Didn't expect to be taken in by a stranger, especially not one with such a nice place. I chuckled, leaning back in my chair. Well, you don't seem like much of a threat. Blake raised an eyebrow, smirking. You'd be surprised. We both laughed, and I poured him another splash of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the firelight. The storm outside roared, on, but inside, it was warm, comfortably so. As the minutes turned into hours, the whiskey began to work its way through our veins, loosening tongues and melting away the last of the tension. Blake talked about his life, how he'd grown up in a small town, left for the city, and never quite found his way back. He spoke of mistakes, of missed chances, of running from something he couldn't quite name. There's always something. Out there, huh? I said, leaning back and stretching out my legs. Blake nodded, swirling his drink. Yeah, something. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. Or someone. I glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow. Someone? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We don't have to talk about that. For a moment, the silence stretched out between us, heavy and loaded. I watched him from across the flickering light, his shoulders slumped slightly, fingers tapping absently against the side of his glass. His eyes were distant, like he was seeing something far away. It's all right, I said quietly, breaking the silence. You don't have to run here. His eyes flicked back to mine, a flash of surprise crossing his face. For a second, I thought he might say something real. But then he looked away, his gaze dropping to his lap. I guess I'm just good at running. The fire crackled, filling the space where words had failed. I didn't press him. Instead, I reached for the blanket draped over the back of the couch and leaned forward, wrapping it around his shoulders. You're still shivering, I murmured, my voice softer than I intended. Blake stiffened at first, then relaxed, his eyes lifting back to mine. My hand lingered on his shoulder a moment too long, fingers brushing against the soft fabric of the flannel shirt I'd given him. His eyes flickered down to my hand, then back up to my face. Thanks, he said, voice barely above a whisper. No problem. I sat back, my hand slipping away, but the warmth of his body lingered on my skin. The whiskey was nearly gone, but neither of us made a move to refill it. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, shadows flickering across the walls, stretching long and thin. Blake's eyes, half-lidded and dark, traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my shoulders. I pretended not to notice, but the warmth I felt had nothing to do with the fire. There was something hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The storm still raged outside, but the tension in the room was louder, more present. I swallowed hard, focusing on the fire, but I could feel his gaze, like fingers running down my skin. You've got a nice place here, he said again, softer, This time, like the words were meant for himself more than me. "Thanks," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "It's quiet, sometimes too quiet." Blake chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe not tonight." I looked up, his eyes locked on mine, unflinching. He didn't look away this time. He just held my gaze, unspoken words dancing in the space between us. And for the first time since I'd opened my door to him, I wondered if maybe I'd let in more than just a stranger. The storm outside raged on, growing fiercer with each passing minute. Wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame. Rain pelted the roof like thousands of tiny fists, relentless and wild. I watched, as the lights flickered once, twice, and then gave up entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Only the fire remained, its warm glow stretching long shadows across the walls, casting everything in shades of orange and gold. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of wood and the distant rumble of thunder. Blake glanced around, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Power go out often out here?" "More than I'd like," I replied, tossing another log onto the fire. Sparks burst to life, flaring brightly before settling back into embers. He leaned back against the couch, stretching his legs out toward the flames. His eyes tracked the flicker of firelight, reflecting something I couldn't quite name. He seemed comfortable, more at ease than when he'd first stumbled in soaked and shaking. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the storm outside and the occasional crack of burning wood. The silence was heavy, pressing down on us, filling the room like a third presence. Blake broke it first. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "You live here all alone?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Just me and the horses. I like the quiet." He smirked, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "I can tell." I laughed, the sound louder than I intended. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, stretching his arms behind his head. "I don't know. Just seems like the kind of place a guy goes when he's looking to be left alone." I considered that, my fingers idly tracing the edge of my whiskey glass. "Maybe," I said finally. "Or maybe it's the kind of place you go when you don't know what you're looking for." Blake's eyes flickered to mine, lingering just a bit too long. The firelight danced between us, stretching shadows across his face, highlighting the curve of his jaw, the faint stubble on his cheeks. He looked like he belonged there, sitting by the fire, the storm raging outside, miles away from anyone who might be looking for him. I leaned back, resting my arm along the back of the couch. "You always just walk up to strange houses in the middle of a storm?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Not usually. But I guess you weren't as strange as I expected." "Not sure if that's a compliment." "It is," he replied, voice softer now, almost tender. He stretched out his legs, the tips of his boots just touching mine. The fire crackled again, louder this time, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney. We fell silent once more, but this time it was different. The space between us wasn't just empty. It was charged, humming with something unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me, tracing the lines of my shoulders, my hands. I pretended not to notice, but my heart thundered in my chest, louder than the storm. Blake shifted, moving just a bit closer. His body heat radiated across the small space, mixing with the scent of rain and whiskey. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared into the fire, trying to focus on the dancing flames instead of the warmth inching nearer. His hand brushed against mine. Barely a touch, just the slightest graze of skin on skin. But it was enough. I felt a spark shoot up my arm, my fingers tingling where we connected. Neither of us pulled away. Blake looked at me, his eyes dark and searching, pupils blown wide in the firelight. I turned to him, my hand still pressed against his. His breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling a little too quickly. "Blake," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He leaned in, tentative but deliberate. Our faces were inches apart, the warmth of his breath brushing against my lips. I could smell the faintest hint of whiskey mixed with rain. His eyes locked onto mine, waiting. My heart pounded, blood rushing in my ears. I closed the distance, pressing my lips to his, Soft at first, just a whisper of contact. Blake inhaled sharply, but he didn't pull away. He pressed back, his hand slipping to the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair. The kiss deepened, slow and exploring. His lips were warm, softer than I expected, tasting faintly of whiskey and something else. Something uniquely him. His hand slipped from my neck to my shoulder, then down my arm, fingers brushing my skin in a way that sent shivers racing down my spine. Outside, the storm roared on, lightning flashing through the windows, thunder rolling like a distant drum. But inside, the only sound that mattered was the crackle of the fire and the soft, breathless noises that slipped between us. I pulled him closer, the blanket slipping from his shoulders and pooling around his waist. His hands moved to my back, gripping me tightly, holding me in place as if afraid I'd slip away. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. The storm outside was chaos and fury, tearing through the plains with unrelenting force. But here, beside the fire, with Blake's lips pressed against mine, it felt like the only safe place in the world. Soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long, golden shadows across the room. The storm had finally passed, leaving only the gentle patter of water dripping from the eaves outside. I blinked awake slowly, the familiar ache of morning stiffness settling in my limbs. For a moment I was disoriented, caught between sleep and reality, the memories of last night blurring with the pale light of dawn. And then I felt it. An arm draped over my chest, warm and heavy, breathing steady and slow. My heart leapt, skipping, a beat as I turned my head. Blake lay beside me, eyes closed, his dark hair mussed and tangled against the pillow. His face was softened by sleep, mouth slightly parted, chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. For a moment, I just watched him, barely daring to breathe. His hand rested against my chest, fingers splayed out like he'd fallen asleep, holding me. I could feel the heat of his skin through my shirt, the weight of his presence more grounding than anything I'd felt in a long time. Then, as if sensing my gaze, his eyelids fluttered. He blinked, eyes focusing slowly, and reality seemed to rush back in for both of us. His arm tensed slightly, but he didn't pull it away. Instead, he blinked up at me, still half asleep, his voice husky with morning rasp. "Guess I owe you for more than just shelter," he said, a lazy grin spreading across his lips. I chuckled, the tension breaking just enough to let me breathe. "I'd say we're even." He laughed softly, the sound warm and real, settling something in my chest. For a moment, we just lay there, neither one moving. It should have been awkward. Hell, it should have been 1,000 kinds of uncomfortable. But it wasn't. It was right. Eventually, Blake shifted, stretching his arms above his head before sitting up slowly. The blanket slipped off his shoulders, and I looked away, swallowing hard as I rubbed the back of my neck. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice cracking just a bit. "God, yes," he replied, running a hand through his hair. I threw on some sweatpants and padded out to the kitchen, the coolness of the wooden floor waking me up fully. I brewed a pot of coffee, the rich, bitter scent filling the room, masking the remnants of rain that still clung to the air. Blake joined me a few minutes later, dressed in my old flannel and a pair of sweats I'd lent him. He looked good in them. Too good, honestly. We sat at the kitchen table, mugs in hand, steam curling between us. The silence was comfortable, a sharp contrast to the tension of the night before. Outside, the plains stretched out as far as the eye could see, glistening with morning dew, the sky washed clean by the storm. Blake took a long sip of his coffee, before setting the mug down, his eyes flickering to mine. "I don't usually do that." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah? Which part? Showing up half dead at a stranger's house in the middle of a storm, or—" He smirked, shaking his head. "You know what I mean." His fingers traced the rim of his cup absently, eyes dropping to the steam swirling from it. "I'm not exactly experienced." I let his words hang between us, watching the way his jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed just slightly. "You did fine," I replied, voice soft. "More than fine." Blake chuckled, but it came out hollow. It's not just that. I mean, before. I've thought about it. A lot. Just never acted on it. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, vulnerable, and raw in a way I hadn't seen before. Guess you could say I'm good at running. I took a breath, setting my own mug down carefully. Maybe you don't have to run here. His eyes softened, just for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something real, something unguarded. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just nodded, staring back down at his coffee. The silence stretched out again, comfortable but heavy with things unsaid. I sipped my coffee, watching him over the rim of my mug. Blake shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together, absently. His eyes met mine again, softer now, almost questioning. You know, I said finally, voice low. Last night wasn't just because of the storm. Blake's gaze held mine, and he swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I know. Something settled between us then, unspoken, but real. A connection that went deeper than just what happened by the fire. I felt it in the way he looked at me, eyes unguarded, searching, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. Storm's over, Blake murmured, glancing out the window. Yeah, I replied, leaning back in my chair with a grin. But you don't have to be. He looked back at me, his smile growing slowly, like he was just realizing he had a choice. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. The midday sun hung high above the ranch, casting long shadows that stretched across the dew-soaked grass. The storm had washed everything clean. The barns shimmered under the sunlight, and the earth smelled fresh, renewed. Blake's car was parked out front, hood popped open where I'd spent the better part of the morning tinkering with the engine, a cracked radiator hose and a dead battery. Nothing that a little elbow grease couldn't fix. Blake stood by the driver's side, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He hadn't said much while I worked, just leaned against the fence post, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now, with the car purring quietly, he loaded his things into the trunk, one by one, taking his time as if dragging out the inevitable. There was a heaviness in the air, thick and unspoken. I watched him slam the trunk shut, his hands lingering. On the edge, fingers curling over the metal as he stared down at the ground. He didn't move to get in. He just stood there, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the dirt beneath his boots. I swallowed hard, shoving my hands into my pockets. You know, I began, my voice a little rougher than I intended. You don't have to go. Blake's head shot up, his eyes meeting mine, surprise flickering across his face. He paused, mouth opening slightly before he closed it again. A long breath slipped from his lungs, and he turned back toward the car, fingers tapping against the roof. And do what? He asked, voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Work the ranch with you? I felt the corner of my mouth lift in a grin I couldn't hide. Maybe. Blake chuckled, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of sincerity, of longing, that he couldn't quite mask. He glanced back at the house, then at me, the tension between us stretching out like a taut wire. You're serious? I shrugged, stepping closer, closing the space between us. Why not? Place could use an extra set of hands. Besides, I paused, eyes locking onto his. You don't seem like you're in a hurry to leave. Blake swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He turned back to the car, hand resting on the handle. For a second, I thought he was going to open it, climb in, and drive off without another word, but he didn't. He stood there, fingers tapping against the metal, eyes fixed on the horizon like he was waiting for a sign. Maybe I'm not, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. I held my breath as he straightened up, turning, back to face me. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering just a bit longer than necessary before he exhaled loudly. Screw it, he muttered, and with one swift motion he popped the trunk, grabbed his duffel bag, and tossed it back onto the porch. I couldn't help the laugh that escaped me. Guess you made up your mind, huh? Blake shrugged, but there was a smile playing at his lips, hesitant but real. Guess I did. We stood there for a moment, the sun warm on our backs, the storm a distant memory. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine, and I watched him make his way back up the steps to the front door. He paused, hand on the doorknob, glancing back at me. "You coming?" I nodded, my feet carrying me forward before I even thought about it. As I stepped onto the porch, I caught his gaze, steady, unblinking, and filled with something I couldn't quite name yet. But I wanted to. Blake pushed open the door, stepping inside, and I followed him in, the cool shade of the house swallowing us whole. He turned to me, hands still resting on the doorknob, eyes searching mine. "Thanks," he said simply. "For what?" Blake smirked. "For not letting me run." And just like that, he closed the door behind us, shutting out the sun and everything beyond the walls of that old ranch house. I stood there for a moment, watching him move through the room, setting, his bag down and settling in like he'd been there forever. And I knew then, this wasn't just a temporary shelter from the storm. This was the start of something else. Something neither of us expected. Weeks slipped by like pages turning in a well-worn book. The storm that had brought Blake to my doorstep was a distant memory now, replaced by the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. The days started early and ended late, filled with the kind of hard work that leaves you bone-tired but satisfied. Blake took to it better than I expected, waking up with the sunrise, shoveling hay, mending fences, and brushing down the horses like he'd been doing it his whole life. I watched him settle in, his hands growing calloused, his stride more confident. There was something natural about him out here, his body moving with an ease that spoke of comfort, maybe even belonging. The old flannel shirts and worn-out jeans he borrowed from my closet suited him, hanging loose on his frame, faded from years of work, but still holding strong. We found a rhythm, Blake and I. Mornings were spent working the land, the sun cresting over the hills as we saddled up the horses or fixed up the broken boards along the fence line. Afternoons were quieter, usually spent in the barn or on the porch, sipping lemonade and listening to the wind whisper through the grass. And evenings, those were my favorite. We'd share dinner at the old oak table, the glow of the kitchen, light casting shadows across his face, his laughter filling the room. Sometimes, after the dishes were washed and the fire was crackling low, we'd sit together on the porch steps, watching the stars blink awake in the endless sky. It was during one of those quiet evenings that something shifted. The sun was setting, low, painting the horizon in shades of orange and crimson. The sky looked like it was on fire, stretched out wide and unbroken over the plains. We had just finished up with the horses, brushing them down and locking up the barn for the night. Blake leaned against the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, eyes distant and thoughtful. I moved beside him, resting my elbows on the fence, letting the warm breeze brush against my skin. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out comfortably between us. Then, without warning, Blake reached over and grabbed my hand, his grip firm and certain. I looked up, surprised, but his eyes stayed locked on the sunset, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess I did end up in your back door after all," he murmured, voice soft and low. I couldn't help the laugh that bubbled up, shaking my head as I squeezed his hand. "And I wouldn't change a thing." He turned to face me then, his eyes catching the last light of the setting sun, making them glow with shades of amber and gold. His hand tightened around mine, pulling me closer, his free hand slipping around my waist. The wind blew softly, rustling the grass at our feet, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers. His eyes held mine, unblinking, and in that moment, I felt it, that pull, that gravity that had been simmering beneath the surface since the night he stumbled onto my land. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the cool evening air. His thumb traced slow circles against my side, and I closed my eyes, just feeling it. The warmth of him, the solidness, the familiarity that felt so much like home. The sky burned with the colors of dusk, stretching out wide and endless above us. And as we stood there, wrapped up in each other, I knew that the storm hadn't just brought him to my ranch. It had brought him to me.